Today, here in the cafe, we are sitting beside a map of the world in the year 1700. Look at the distortions of the geography of the time. Japan is huge. The islands of the South Pacific are huge. The east coast of Australia is still unknown. The east coast of Papua New Guinea is still unknown. The west coast of North America is still unknown. And Nova Scotia, which we are once again talking about today, is huge. It covers, at this time, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island, and parts of Maine. Today, we are doing part 2 of the fortifications of Nova Scotia. Today, we are focusing on the Halifax region and Cape Breton. Here is Nova Scotia. We are doing this area and here today. The first part. Chebucto Head. Chebucto Head is a Canadian headland on Nova Scotia's Chebucto Peninsula, located within the community of Duncan's Cove. Chebucto Head forms the most easterly point on the peninsula and is used to define the southwestern limit of Halifax Harbour. Historically known to the Mi'kmaq Nation as Jipigtug, anglicized as Chebucto, meaning the biggest harbour, or simply the Big Harbour. A line drawn northeast from Chebucto Head to Pennant Point defines the southern geographic limit of the harbour. The actual legal limit of the harbour is located further inland to the north of this line. The lighthouse. The first lighthouse at Chebucto Head was built in 1872 with a steam foghorn just below it. It was replaced by a second tower in 1928. This tower was demolished in 1940 and a new lighthouse and combined keeper's dwelling, which is what is there now, was built several hundred meters to the north to make way for a gun battery. In 1967, the light was moved from the house to a new concrete tower, which still stands today. The house remained the keeper's dwelling until the light was destaffed in the 1990s. The house fell prey to repeated vandalism after the Canadian Coast Guard, the CCG, canceled the lease of the tenants who lived in and looked after the house. The plight of the lighthouse helped to inspire the Nova Scotia Lighthouse Preservation Society to push for the Heritage Lighthouse Protection Act, a campaign that was launched at the Chebucto Head Lighthouse on March 11, 1999. The house was destroyed by a suspicious fire on March 25, 2004. The Chebucto Head Lighthouse Society, a group formed to try to save the lighthouse, continues to work to keep the site preserved and open to the public. Chebucto Head was used by the CCG as the control center for the Vessel Traffic Service, or VTS, that controlled vessel movements in Halifax Harbour until the 1980s, when a new control center was opened at Shannon Hill, above the Bedford Institute of Oceanography in Dartmouth. It continues as a remote aids to navigation station. Chebucto Head inspired the name of the large harbor tug Point Chebucto, built at Halifax Shipyard in 1992. The gun battery, which was here. During World War II, Halifax Harbour was the primary fast convoy departure and arrival point in eastern North America. The Royal Canadian Artillery operated a searchlight and coastal gun battery at Chebucto Head as part of Fortress Halifax, as a means of providing an integrated defense for the port. The Chebucto Head Battery was the key outer battery of the western side of the harbor, defending it from possible attacks by German U-boats or surface raiders. The fortified battery was armed with three Ellswick 6-inch 150mm naval guns with associated searchlight director tower, generators, a long-range optical rangefinder, and by 1943, a radar artillery control unit. The battery was decommissioned in the early 1950s, but many bunkers remain, now privately owned. On 16 April 1945, HMCS Esquimalt, a minesweeper, was torpedoed and sunk off Chebucto Head by U-190, becoming the last Royal Canadian Navy warship lost to enemy action in World War II. The Connaught Battery is a World War I era harbor defense battery located north of York Redoubt at Ferguson's Cove, Nova Scotia, Canada. It took its name from the then Governor General of Canada, the Duke of Connaught, who was Queen Victoria's third son. Construction. Built between 1912 and 1917, the battery was a part of Halifax Harbour's larger defense complex, which included other fortifications such as Fort George, Citadel Hill, and Connaught Battery was the only new structure built by the military after 1905, with a grand total area of 2.5 hectares and a floor space of 447 square meters. Since its inception, Halifax Harbour has always had strategic and commercial importance. Beginning in the colony's early days, it was a well-fortified location. During the Second World War, its defenses included three 4.7-inch quick-firing guns, here, here, and here. Today, Connaught Battery is an abandoned complex, but open to the public to use as a municipal park. The cement casemates of the fort remain in good condition. Cranberry Point Battery was a First World War era coastal defense battery which defended the approaches to Sydney Harbor up here. It originally consisted of two 4.7-inch quick-firing guns, which were later removed and replaced with a concrete observation tower and two concrete searchlight emplacements. The Devil's Battery, or Devil's Point Battery, Hartland Point or Heartland Point Tunnels, was a complex military installation at the mouth of Halifax Harbour in the community of Eastern Passage at Heartland Point, Canada. It was built between 1940 and 1945 to protect the Halifax area against the German Navy. It was operational until the 1950s. The site had three 9.2-inch 234mm breech-loading Mark 10 guns, operated by the 53rd Heavy Battery of the 1st Halifax Coast Regiment. It is now a golf course. The original underground armaments remain buried. Devil's Battery was named for Devil's Island, which is adjacent to the embankment of Heartland's Point. Construction. On September 10, 1939, Prime Minister William Lloyd Mackenzie King and the Parliament of Canada declared war against Nazi Germany. The federal government relocated the fishermen of Devil's Island to the mainland of Eastern Passage. However, the lighthouse keeper remained. Architect. The progressive development for this military structure was supplied by Britain to the Royal Canadian Engineers, while Spion Cop Battery near Ferguson's Cove, Nova Scotia, was taken out of operation. York Redoubt Fort McNabb, Chebucto Head, Strawberry, and Connaught Battery were quickly upgraded and rearmed. Unlike Devil's Battery, which was built from scratch and made one of the largest coastal defenses on the Atlantic seaboard, many or all of these eastern batteries were contracted to private firms. Devil's Battery was subcontracted to the Toronto firm of Angus Robertson. It was the last time that such building was outsourced to the private sector. Aside from the hired draftsmen, mechanics, and journeymen, much of the labor needed was undertaken by people in the passage. These local residents had a reputation of being hired for Department of National Defense, developmental structures, and posts. A-23 Elkins Barracks was another home defense project for soldiers in training and also used as a dormitory, less than 3 kilometers or 2 miles away. The fortress. After July 17, 1940, military road patrols were deployed near familiar harbor viewpoints to keep Sunday drivers away from any forts. Hartland's Point was a long-time military property, and an additional 285 acres, 115 hectares, was purchased. A community of houses was expropriated when the battery was installed. This removed the inhabitants from danger in the event of action. To minimize the target and disguise its existence, Devil's Battery was buried below ground. You can see just how low it was built. The lowest level contained heating and air circulation. The second level was for plotting rooms, and the top underground level below the guns had the quarters, chart rooms, telephones, and magazine storage. All components were connected by insulated soundproof tunnels converging on the command post. The magazines were isolated from the rest of the complex. Devil's Battery generated its own power in a separate underground facility with a large hydraulic system. The underground diesel flywheel is the size of a 2-story house. It took 2 engines to turn it over. The gatehouse. Here. The barracks, the gatehouse. The sloping hillside embankment along the shore exposes the structured reinforced guard post, isolated from the rest of the fort. It is annexed to an ample concrete wall that holds the main entrance, distantly leading into the underground plotting room and 3 covered walking channels that proceed to the network of undersurface interconnections. Flandrum Hill and Osborne Head. The 2 highest land elevations surveyed for Devil's Battery observation posts were Flandrum Hill and Cow Bay, and Caldwell Road between A-23 Barracks and Radio 16 aircraft direction radar on Scott Drive. Each elevated point had a 4-story reinforced concrete Victoria Fortress observation post, with plotting rooms and telephones connected to the Halifax Fire Command post. 2 other 3-story observation posts were erected, one at the new radar installation at Osborne Head, and the other above the hill behind the 3 tunnels. Each lookout was staffed by a crew of 2 on the top story using a depression position finder, looking out towards the harbor for any suspicious targets. Deception. Devil's Battery would not appear to an enemy U-boat, E-boat, or aircraft to be a defense emplacement, but it could not be distinguished as a battery either. The complex was made out to be a farm. The 3 emplacement turrets holding the guns were masked as farmhouses. The observation post behind the site had the appearance of a church, 750 meters, 800 yards east, near the Osborne Head radar station. A dummy battery was installed with props. Early problems. Early maneuvers during the winter months, running the fort and executing the 9.2-inch guns were a problem. Installed by cranes during construction, one of the 28-ton guns accidentally broke away from its lashed cables and smashed through the vast concrete apron that had been poured over frozen ground, sinking 3 meters, 9 feet, into the thawed earth. Leaks in the subsurface were a nuisance. The complexity of the hydraulic system design had flaws, and mechanical failures under the Earth's surface would occur. Although the hydraulic fluid was a cheap economy brand, when time came to change the system and fire the guns off for a crowd of engineers and invited dignitaries, many of the welds failed, and 6,800 liters, 1,500 gallons of crude hydraulic oil flooded and drenched the interior of the battery. Carefully crafted and fine machined fittings were prefabricated in England to precise specifications. However, they could not be made to fit as they were expected to. Fort Clarence. We looked at this plaque before in previous videos. Fort Clarence, formerly the Eastern Battery, was a British coastal fort built in 1754 at the beginning of the French and Indian War in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, now part of Canada. The battery was built on the grant of Captain John Bruce. Governor Edward Cornwallis's principal engineer, John Bruce, designed the fort, which was 35 to 40 feet above sea level. There was initially a small battery of 7 12-pounder smoothbore cannon. In spring 1759, a Mi'kmaq attack on the Eastern Battery killed 5 soldiers. This is what this plaque commemorates. On November 17, 1778, the King's Orange Rangers arrived by sea at Halifax, probably to discourage desertions by relocating the men to a place much further away from their homes. The KOR was assigned to protect the Eastern Battery on the shore of Halifax Harbor at the south end of Woodside, now the neighborhood of Imperial Royal. This is the old gatehouse. Eastern Battery was renamed Fort Clarence by Prince Edward on 20th October 1798 in honor of his brother, the Duke of Clarence, and St. Andrews, later King William IV. And in the late 1790s, a Martello Tower, this thing, replaced the blockhouse. The blockhouse would have looked like any other blockhouse. The Martello Tower replaced it. The fort was rebuilt with stone in the 1860s, the stone fortifications. In 1929, Imperial Oil purchased the site, which became part of its Dartmouth refinery, and the remaining pieces of the fort were buried in the 1940s. The refinery was converted to an oil storage depot in 2013. Archaeologists have called for the fort to be excavated. Here it is today, or here it is at the time when Imperial Oil bought it. This is the Martello Tower. George's Island, named after King George II, is a glacial drumlin and the largest island entirely within the harbor limits of Halifax Harbor. Located in Nova Scotia's Halifax Regional Municipality. The island is the location of Fort Charlotte, named after King George III's wife, Charlotte. Fort Charlotte was built during Father Le Loutre's War, a year after Citadel Hill, or Fort George. The island is now a National Historic Site of Canada. As of August 6, 2020, the island is open to the public on the weekends and Fridays during peak summer season from June until Thanksgiving weekend. History. The island was originally named Ile à la Raquette, which means snowshoe island. For a brief time, the island was known as Ile d'Anville, named after the leader of the Great Duc d'Anville expedition, who was buried on the island for a number of years. In 1749, the island was renamed George's Island after King George II, and then finally, in 1963, it was named George's Island. Here's an image about the Duc d'Anville, which failed through disease and not getting their cannons. Here is an image of the HMS Nottingham sinking the French ship Mars and preventing cannons from ever arriving for the French in North America. Here is the grave of the Duc d'Anville. This is encampment monument, which is at Birch Cove, Halifax, Nova Scotia. Upon the arrival of Edward Cornwallis and the outbreak of Father Le Loutre's War, fortifications were established on Citadel Hill, or Fort George, in 1749, and George's Island, Fort Charlotte, in 1750. Here is the original look of Halifax, with 5 star forts, 4 corner star forts, and here is George's Island. During the 7 Years' War, 2,000 French sailors were imprisoned on the island after the British victory in the Battle off Cape Race, Newfoundland. During the war, Fort Charlotte was one of the 4 forts where Acadians were imprisoned over the 9 years of the expulsion of the Acadians. The others were Fort Frederick, St. John, New Brunswick, Fort Cumberland, which was Fort Beausejour, and Fort Edward, Windsor. The Acadian prisoners, here's an image of the expulsion at Grand Pre. The Acadian prisoners in the vicinity of Halifax were subject to various degrees of confinement and dependence upon victualization, which means while they were in the place, they were dependent on the British for their food. Victualization is another way to say food. Without the right to own land continuously from 1759 to 1768. According to historian Ronnie Gilles Leblanc, there were approximately 1,660 Acadians held prisoner on the island during the deportation in 1755 to 1763, with a maximum of 600 prisoners at one time. Many Acadian men in the region were occupied with road building, fisheries, wharf building, and wood cutting, and lodged close to where they worked. During the American Revolution, the 84th Regiment of Foot, the Royal Highland Immigrants, were stationed at the fort to protect the harbor from American privateers. Numerous American privateers were held prisoner in the fort throughout the war. George's Island was part of the Halifax Defense Complex from the mid-18th century to the Second World War, with Citadel Hill and Fort Charlotte on the island being restored by Parks Canada. For nearly 200 years, Georges Island was the scene of constant military activity. Tales of executions, forts, and hidden tunnels surround the folklore associated with the mysterious island. It had an island prison camp, a lookout point, an Acadian prison camp, and a quarantine station. The Georges Island Lighthouse was established on the island in 1876. The original wooden tower burned in 1916 and was replaced by an octagonal concrete tower in 1917. The light was staffed until 1972, when it was automated. One of the most notable prisoners of the island fortress was privateer David Ropes of the 13 colonies. Today, in March 2009, the federal government designated $3.5 million to install water, sewer, and electrical services on the National Historic Site over the following year. This would be the first step towards opening the island, said Carla Wheaton, Parks Canada Cultural Resource Manager. Following that, we would still need to construct visitor facilities, such as washrooms and possibly a visitors center. As of summer 2020, the island is open to the public on weekends and Fridays in July and August. The island may be visited from the second weekend in June until Thanksgiving weekend in October. Getting to the island can be done either via Ambassador's Ferry. I used to work for Ambassador's in 1990 as a kilted tour guide from the Halifax waterfront. Canadian money, $26.75 per adult, which includes historic site access, or private vessel. Must purchase historic site access upon landing on the island, $8.50 per adult. The Canadian Coast Guard operates an unstaffed radar station commissioned in 1977. The Fortress of Louisbourg, in French, Fortress de Louisbourg, is a tourist attraction as a National Historic Site and the location of a one-quarter partial reconstruction of an 18th century French fortress at Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island, Nova Scotia. It's not a very clear map. Here's Cape Breton. Louisbourg is here near Glace Bay. Its two sieges, especially that of 1758, were turning points in the Anglo-French struggle for what today is Canada. The original settlement was founded in 1713 by settlers from Terre-Neuve and initially called Havre à Langlois, English port. The reason why was nearby was the remains of a Scottish fort that was built in 1629, Baleen. Subsequently, the fishing port grew to become a major commercial port and a strongly defended fortress. The fortifications eventually surrounded the town. The walls were constructed mainly between 1720 and 1740. By the mid-1740s, Louisbourg, named for Louis XIV of France, was one of the most extensive and expensive European fortifications constructed in North America. The site was supported by two smaller garrisons on Ile Royale, located at present-day St. Peter's and Englishtown. The fortress of Louisbourg suffered key weaknesses, since it was erected on low-lying ground commanded by nearby hills, and its design was directed mainly toward sea-based assaults. The problem with low-lying ground is disease. The garrison and people of the town were constantly sick due to Nova Scotian weather and being built on a swamp. The land-facing defenses were relatively weak. A third weakness was that it was a long way from France or Quebec. from which reinforcements might be sent. It was captured by British colonists in 1745 and was a major bargaining chip in the negotiations leading to the 1748 treaty, ending the War of the Austrian Succession. It was returned to the French in exchange for border towns and what is today Belgium. It was captured again in 1758 by British forces in the 7 Years' War, after which its fortifications were systematically destroyed by British engineers. The British continued to have a garrison at Louisbourg until 1768, but had abandoned the site by 1785. The order at the end was to leave no two stones standing, so that the fortress could never be returned to the French as such. The fortress and town were partially reconstructed in a project that started in 1961 and continued into the 1970s. The head stonemason for this project was Ron Bovaird. This reconstruction work provided jobs for unemployed coal miners, but relied on expropriating an entire community known as West Louisbourg. Additional restoration was completed in 2018 to 2020, and again in 2022 to 2023 after Hurricane Fiona. The earlier of the two projects was intended to protect the site from rising water and to restore parts of the fortress. The Fortress of Louisbourg National Historic Site is operated by Parks Canada as a living history museum. The site stands as the largest reconstruction project in North America. Its history. French settlement on Ile Royale, now Cape Breton Island, can be traced to the early 17th century following settlements in Acadia that were concentrated on Bay Francais, now the Bay of Fundy, such as Port Royal and other locations. We'll take a look at this again. Cape Breton, and here's the Bay of Fundy, and Port Royal is here. In present-day peninsular Nova Scotia. A French settlement at Sainte Anne, down here in the bottom, and also up here. The University of Sainte Anne is down here in Meteghan on the French shore. There's another fort in Cape Breton also called Sainte Anne. Okay. Lasting until 1641. A fur trading post was established on the site from 1651 to 1659, but Ile Royale languished under French rule as attention was focused on the St. Lawrence River, going up here. And the Great Lakes Colony of Canada, which then comprised parts of what is now Quebec, Ontario, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Illinois. Louisiana, which encompassed the current Mississippi Valley states and part of Texas, and the small agricultural settlements of mainland Acadia, such as Grand Pre. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 gave Britain control of a part of Acadia, which was peninsular Nova Scotia, this part, and Newfoundland. However, France maintained control of its colonies at Ile Royale, Ile Saint-Jean, now Prince Edward Island, and Canada and Louisiana, with Ile Royale being France's only territory directly on the Atlantic seaboard, which was controlled by Britain from Newfoundland to present-day South Carolina, and it was strategically close to important fishing grounds on the Grand Banks, which would be out here, of Newfoundland, as well as being well placed for protecting the entrance to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Here is Philippe de Pasteur de Costabel. He was the first governor of Ile Royale. In 1713, France set about constructing Port Dauphin and a limited naval support base at the former site of Fort St. Anne. However, the winter icing conditions of the harbor led the French to choose another harbor on the southeastern part of Ile Royale. The harbor, being ice-free and well protected, soon became a winter port for French naval forces on the Atlantic seaboard, and they named it Havre-Louisbourg Harbor, after King Louis XIV. So this Dauphin Gate is actually in the fortress of Louisbourg, rather than the fort called Dauphin. Here's a better look at the fortifications that surround the settlement of Louisbourg. Originally took 28 years to build. Looks pretty solid from the land, but it wasn't necessarily so solid. The first siege. British forces besieged Louisbourg in 1745. British captured the fortress, but returned it to the French at the end of the War of the Austrian Succession. The fortress was besieged in 1745 by a New England force, backed by a Royal Navy squadron. The New England attackers succeeded when the fortress capitulated on June 16, 1745. A major expedition by the French to recapture the fortress, led by Jean-Baptiste de la Rochefoucauld de Roy, the Duc d'Anville, the following year, was destroyed by storms, disease, and British naval attacks before it ever reached the fortress. It was probably smallpox, but recent historians say it was perhaps cholera was the disease that was killing the French and the Mi'kmaq and the Acadians who were gathering in where Halifax would eventually be built in 1746-47. Having given up, okay. Louisbourg was returned. In 1748, the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, which ended the War of the Austrian Succession, restored Louisbourg to France in return for territory gained in the Austrian Netherlands and the British trading post at Madras in India. Maurepas, the Minister de la Marine, was determined to have it back. He regarded the fortified harbor as essential to maintaining French dominance in the fisheries of the area. The disgust of the French in this transaction was matched by that of the English colonists. They were both disgusted. The New England forces left, taking with them the famous Louisbourg cross, which had hung in the fortress chapel. This cross was rediscovered in the Harvard University archives only in the latter half of the 20th century. It is now on long-term loan to the Louisbourg Historic Site. So it's actually now the property of Harvard University. Having given up Louisbourg, Britain in 1749 created its own fortified town on Chebucto Bay, which they named Halifax. It soon became the largest Royal Navy base on the Atlantic coast and hosted large numbers of British Army regulars. The 29th Regiment of Foot was stationed there. They cleared the land for the port and settlement. So the people who were actually chopping the trees down weren't the settlers. They were actually the soldiers of the 29th Regiment of Foot. The second siege. Britain's American colonies were expanding into the areas claimed by France by the 1750s, and the efforts of the French forces and their First Nation allies to seal off the westward passes and approaches through which American colonists would move west soon led to the skirmishes that developed into the French and Indian Wars in 1754. The conflict widened into the larger 7 Years' War by 1756, which involved all of the major European powers. A large-scale French naval deployment in 1757 fended off an attempted assault by the British in 1757. However, inadequate naval support the following year allowed a large British combined operation led by Geoffrey Amherst to land for the 1758 siege of Louisbourg, which ended after a siege of 6 weeks on 26 July 1758 with a French surrender. The fortress was used by the British as a launching point for its 1759 siege of Quebec that culminated in the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. Point to note is the first half Nova Scotian, Anglophone Nova Scotian unit that were to be raised in North America, the 40th Regiment of Foot, detached its two grenadier companies to become the garrison of the fortress of Louisbourg until 1768. Governors. Okay, here's a little bit more about the siege of Louisbourg. Here is the burning of the French ship Prudent and the capture of the Blonde Saint during the siege of Louisbourg in 1758. Governors. There were quite a few. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. So 16 governors. Here is what the fortress looked like under British control. This is a depiction of the port of Louisbourg prior to the fortress's dismantling by the British. At the time, the settlement was the third busiest port in North America. Remember that it had been returned to France once before after a long battle and capture, and the British will not return the fortress ever again to France. In 1768, the order was given to leave no two stones standing, and they demolished the fort. The 20th century. The site of the fortress was designated a National Historic Site in 1920. In 1961, the Governor of Canada decided to undertake a historical reconstruction of 1/5 of the town and fortifications, with the aim being to recreate Louisbourg as it would have been at its height in 1744. The $26 million project required an interdisciplinary effort by archaeologists, historians, engineers, and architects. Some craftsmen came from other countries, but most of the reconstruction work was completed by locals, including unemployed coal miners from the industrial Cape Breton area. Over the years, they constructed some of the 60 buildings and 2 bastions. Many of the workers learned 18th century French masonry techniques and other skills to create an accurate replica. Here is the recreation of the military chapel in the fortress of Louisbourg. Today, the entire site of the fortress, including the 1/5 reconstruction, is the Fortress of Louisbourg National Historic Site of Canada, operated by Parks Canada. Offerings include guided and unguided tours, and the demonstration and explanation of period weapons, including muskets and a cannon. And they are operated by enactors wearing period clothing, like this. Here's a demonstration of the cannons used in the 18th century at the fortress. Children's programming includes puppet shows and the museum caretaker's residence, built in 1935 to 1936. Within the site is a classified federal heritage building. The fortress also greatly aided the local economy of the town of Louisbourg, as it struggled to diversify economically with the decline of the North Atlantic fishery and the decline of coal mining. On 5th May 1995, Canada Post issued The Fortress of Louisbourg series to mark the 275th anniversary of the official founding of the fortress, the 250th anniversary of the siege by the New Englanders, the 100th anniversary of the commemoration by the Society of Colonial Wars, and the 100th anniversary of the arrival of the Sydney and Louisbourg Railway, the S&L. The Fortress of Louisbourg series includes the Harbour and Dauphin Gate. The Dauphin Gate would be the entrance to here. The 18th century Louisbourg, the King's Bastion. This whole thing is the King's Bastion. The King's Garden, Convent, Hospital, and British Barracks. The fortifications and ruins fronting the sea and Rochefort Point. The 43-cent stamps were designed by Rolf P. Harder. Fortified town. The Fortress of Louisbourg, here's a picture here of the Government of Canada rebuilt 1/5 of the town and its fortifications, which was the multi-year work commenced in 1963. This is what it looked like before the reconstruction. These 4 arches were all that remained of the fortified town by the time the site was designated as a historic site in 1920. This photograph also shows a number of homes which were built on the site in modern times. They were eventually expropriated. These houses were not historical. These are just people's houses that were eventually taken. The Fortress of Louisbourg was the capital for the colony of Ile Royale and was located on the Atlantic coast of Cape Breton Island near its southeastern point. The location for the fortress was chosen because it was easy to defend against British troops. British ships attempting to either block or attack the St. Lawrence River. At the time, the only way to get goods to Canada and its cities of Quebec and Montreal. South of the fort, a reef provided a natural barrier, while a large island provided a good location for a battery. These defenses forced British ships to enter the harbor via a 500-foot, 150-meter channel. The fort was built to protect and provide a base for France's lucrative North American fishery and to protect Quebec City from British invasions. For this reason, it had been given the nicknames Gibraltar of the North or the Dunkirk of America. The fort was also built to protect France's hold on one of the richest fishing grounds in the world, the Grand Banks. 116 men, 10 women, and 23 children originally settled in Louisbourg. The population quickly grew. In 1719, 823 people called the maritime city their home. 7 years later, in 1726, the population was 1,296. In 1734, it was 1,616. And by 1752, the population of Louisbourg was 4,174. Of course, population growth did not come without consequences. Smallpox ravaged the population in 1731 and 1732. But Louisbourg continued to grow, especially economically. So one of the biggest problems the French had was cholera, and at this time it was directly smallpox. At the capture of the fortress, the French soldiers and inhabitants were expelled back to France after the British capture in 1758. The fortifications and town at Louisbourg were systematically destroyed by British engineers beginning in 1760 to prevent the town and port from being used in the future by the French, should the peace process return Cape Breton Island to France, or by anyone else. Demolition by British engineers took 6 years. The British kept a garrison at Louisbourg, the 40th Regiment of Foot. They were called the Louisbourg Fusiliers at the time. until 1768. Some of the cut stones from Louisbourg were shipped to Halifax to be reused, and in the 1780s to Sydney, Nova Scotia. During the reconstruction of Fortress Louisbourg, more than 1 million artifacts were uncovered by archaeologists. Point Pleasant Park is a large, mainly forested municipal park at the southern tip of the Halifax Peninsula. Here is the original Halifax fortification. As you look down the harbor this way, this is Dartmouth, Halifax original. Here is Fort Duncan. Here's the Naval Yard. Point Pleasant Park starts here at what was called Fort Massey, and this way. Here is Halifax Harbor again at the time. And as you can see, here is the fort, which was at this time eventually called, Fort George. And looking this way would have been Point Pleasant Park. It once hosted several artillery batteries and contains the Prince of Wales Tower. This is the oldest Martello Tower in North America. It was built in 1796. The park is a popular recreational spot for Haligonians. In England, people from Halifax are Halifaxians, but in Canada, they are Haligonians, as it hosts forest walks and affords views across the harbor and out toward the Atlantic. Plays are performed in the park every summer by a professional theatre company called Shakespeare by the Sea. The performances take place at Cambridge Battery and include both Shakespearean and productions and original musicals based on classic fairy tales for the audiences of all ages. The company also operates an 80-seat Park Place Theatre in the lower parking lot of the park, which is used as a rain venue during the summer and for fall and winter indoor productions. Point Pleasant Park originally was owned by the British government and was leased to the city of Halifax for a ceremonial 1 shilling per year. The original lease for the land was negotiated by Sir William Young in 1866. The park is now owned by the Government of Canada and is leased to the Halifax Regional Municipality. The lease for the park is administered on behalf of the Government of Canada by the Parks Canada Agency. History, the 18th, 19th century. St. Aspenquid Chapel. St. Aspenquid's Chapel was established by a French missionary, Louis-Pierre Thury, at Chebucto, present-day Halifax, Nova Scotia, in the late 17th century. The chapel is a natural stone amphitheater located by Chain Rock Battery on the northwest arm at Point Pleasant Park. There are numerous notable people who were interred in the burial grounds around the chapel. The chapel was also the location of the Mi'kmaq celebration of the Feast of St. Aspenquid's Day, which was conducted through much of the 18th century. The chapel is also the site of a battle during the French and Indian War between two Mi'kmaq chiefs in 1760. So the Mi'kmaq didn't get along with each other, let alone British. Okay, this is the gravesite of Jean-Baptiste Cope, who made deals with Cornwallis and other British that he immediately afterwards broke and then murdered British officers. Establishing Halifax. In 1749, Edward Cornwallis arrived under instruction of the British government to create a sizable military and civilian settlement of 4,000 in Halifax. Which sparked Father Le Loutre's War. He first settled Point Pleasant Park, but then, being too exposed to the elements, moved the settlement below Citadel Hill There's Father Le Loutre's Wars detail. Here's a map of Acadia in 1743, and Father Le Loutre's War was from 21st June 1749 to 16th June 1755. Here is the original settlement of Halifax. Citadel Hill is here. Halifax was to become a strategic settlement for the British, and fortifications were primarily intended to prevent enemy ships from getting into the Halifax harbor. Fortifications began to be constructed at present-day Point Pleasant Park toward the end of the French and Indian War. There was a total of 7 fortifications constructed. Here's a map of Point Pleasant Park. The locations were Chain Rock and Chain Battery here, Point Pleasant Battery here, Northwest Arm Battery here, Fort Ogilvie here, Prince of Wales Tower here, and Cambridge Battery here. Most were rebuilt or modified 4 or 5 times over the subsequent 200 years. Here is an image of the Chain Battery as it appears today. Here is an image of Point Pleasant Battery and an explanation of what it looks. What are you looking at, including the cookhouse, the ablution or washing room, the toilets. Number 2, 12-pounder gun position. Here's the shelters, and the Shell and Cambridge stores are behind. There's number 1 of the 12-pounder gun positions. Here's the telephone room, and here's the officers' quarters. Here's a closer look at Point Pleasant Battery as it appears today. Here is the gatehouse of the Northwest Arm Battery in the 1940s. Here's another look at the Northwest Arm Battery now, as it appears now. Here's more of the Northwest Arm Battery. Here is an image of Fort Ogilvie. Here's an image of what Fort Ogilvie looks like today. Here's another image of the Martello Tower. So, there were 4 defenses that were constructed during the French and Indian War. Once again, the first one was Chain Battery. Chain Battery, once again, the Point Pleasant Battery, and the Northwest Arm Battery. Northwest Arm, or the Northwest Arm Battery. The defenses were built of logs, earth, and stone. They were built with wood-burning fireplaces and furnaces, which were later added for smelting cannon shot. Chain battery and chain rock were basic fortifications built on the natural terrain to protect the Northwest Arm. Unlike most of the other fortifications, the battery here was not rebuilt in the 19th century, so it retains its original 1762 layout. Because it was abandoned so early, the area has been reforested for most of the historic period. Point Pleasant Battery is one of the oldest fortification batteries. Though Point Pleasant Battery was first constructed in 1762, what is visible today dates mostly from the early 20th century. The fourth battery, the Northwest Arm Battery, was built during the war, just west of Point Pleasant, and was damaged in 1895 and was falling into the sea. It was moved further along the Northwest Arm shore. Northwest Arm Battery was first built in 1762 and disused after the 1860s. Archaeological remains associated with the barracks include a summer house built for the park in the 1880s. The battery here retains its early 19th century configuration. Here is one of the cannons dating from that period at the end of the 19th century, rather than the more modern 20th century ones. This is a 23-pounder smooth bore cannon. Here is this huge half circle, which was made of iron. This was traversing platform, and the tires here were called racers, so that the cannon could turn as if on a turret. The French Revolutionary Wars. In 1792, during the French Revolutionary Wars, the threat of an immediate French attack alerted the British military in Halifax to the possibility of a landing in the harbor, and batteries were upgraded and improved. Fort Ogilvie was built at this time and is located in the eastern part of Point Pleasant Park. Once again, Fort Ogilvie, which was built at that time. It is built by the order of General Ogilvie, then commander of the Halifax garrison. Ogilvie named the battery after himself. In 1796 to 97, a battery was built on the high ground behind the point at a location capable of defending the point batteries. Fort Ogilvie, once again, this is Fort Ogilvie. And we're talking about the high ground here. Okay? A few years later, the battery was converted to a large round stone tower, known as the Prince of Wales Tower. And it's 26 feet high and is 72 feet in diameter. The exposed material is ironstone rubble masonry with an 8-foot thick, 2.4 meter walls. The original construction permitted 6 mounted guns on the roof and 4 guns on the second story. Further modifications were made over the next 70 years. By 1813, the tower mounted 4 6-pound guns on garrison carriages on its barrack level, with 2 24-pound guns on traversing platforms and 6 24-pound carronades on the traversing sides on top. After 1864, the tower was used as a self-defensible depot magazine. The park was the site of several small farms during the early settlement of Halifax. A small outcropping at Black Rock Beach was used to gibbet the bodies of executed criminals such as the pirate Edward Jordan in 1809. This iron rack thing is called a gibbet or gibbet. Here is an illustration of the gun emplacements of the time at the end of the 19th century. Here's another one of the guns. This one is still there. Cambridge Battery. This is actually Cambridge Battery. Is situated back from the Point Pleasant and Northwest Arm batteries along the shore. It was approved in 1862 and completed in 1868. The battery was named in honor of the Duke of Cambridge, who was the head of the military during much of Queen Victoria's reign. The 20th century. The Cambridge Battery was abandoned by the time of the First World War. In 1929, the military temporarily vacated the park before returning in 1938. Okay, here's an abandoned gun position. Before returning in 1938 during the Second World War. Although the Martello Tower ceased to be important for military purposes in the late 19th century, some of the other fortifications in the park continued to be used by the military until the close of the Second World War. Fort Ogilvie and Cambridge Battery were upgraded with modern weapons during the Second World War. A gun from this era is still visible at Fort Ogilvie. Small amounts of stone were quarried in the park in the 19th century. The small quarries today forming a pond near the park entrance. In the 1920s, the Halifax streetcar line was extended into the park as far as the Prince of Wales Tower, but the route was abandoned in the 1940s. The park was the target of a group calling itself Loki 7 in 1994 when they planted a pipe bomb in a garbage bin. Nobody was injured. In 1943, a Canadian steamship, the SS Point Pleasant Park, was named after the park. The mayor of Halifax presented the ship's captain with a framed picture of the Yonge Street Gate, which was displayed in the dining room aboard the ship until it was torpedoed in 1945. In 2000, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency planned to cut 10,000 trees to halt an outbreak of brown spruce longhorn beetles. This plan was challenged by the Friends of Point Pleasant Park in the courts, which resulted in a temporary injunction stopping the cutting. The injunction was later removed, but there was a reduction in tree cutting to less than 2,000. 21st century. In September 2003, Point Pleasant Park was devastated by Hurricane Juan. Nearly three-quarters of the park's trees were knocked down, and the park remained closed until 2004. While there were still trees remaining, the park now had a very thin canopy. Assistance from the Canadian federal government allowed Halifax Regional Municipality to make significant progress in the recovery and renewal of the park. As of June 2008, over 70,000 Acadian forest trees had been planted in the park, surpassing the number of trees lost to Hurricane Juan. The comprehensive plan for Point Pleasant Park proposed long-term care for the park's forest based on Canada's national standard for sustainable forest management. The process of adaptive management would be used to guide the renewal and care of Point Pleasant, one of Canada's oldest urban parks. Military monuments. Point Pleasant Park is the location to numerous monuments associated with the heritage of Halifax and the sea. The largest is the Halifax Monument, better known as the Sailors' Memorial, which commemorates members of the Royal Canadian Navy, the Canadian Merchant Navy, and the Canadian Army, who were lost at sea. It was first erected in 1924 in a headland near the park, but moved to Citadel Hill in 1954 when names from World War II were added. However, the cross on Citadel Hill had decayed by 1966, so it was replaced in 1967 by the present monument in Point Pleasant. The current memorial consists of a cross of sacrifice inscribed with the names of 3,257 Canadian men and women who were buried at sea as a result of the World Wars. The most well-known casualties listed on the monument are the nursing sisters who died on the HMHS Llandovery Castle during World War I, 415 Canadians from naval and merchant ships who died in the Atlantic Ocean during World War I. The original monument has been replaced by two later monuments. The ship's anchor from the aircraft carrier HMCS Bonaventure is a monument to the men and women who died while serving the Canadian Navy during peacetime. A cairn marks the men killed in the sinking of the Canadian Merchant Navy ship Point Pleasant Park in 1945. A monument facing the northwest arm honors Walter Hose, a naval commander who helped build the Royal Canadian Navy, while another honors the families who ran the Northwest Arm Ferry and performed many rescues. National Historic Site plaques in the park commemorate the role of Halifax as a naval post and the battle between HMS Shannon and the USS Chesapeake in 1813. War of 1812. This post shows the War of 1812. War of 1812, Halifax, Nova Scotia, and the HMS Shannon leading the Chesapeake, the captured ship, American frigate USS Chesapeake, into Halifax Harbor in 1813. Next place. Remember, there are two St. Anne's, one in Meteghan, past Digby, and the other one is in Cape Breton. Fort St. Anne is a former French military fort located at present-day Englishtown, Nova Scotia, on the island of Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, Canada. The fort was built by Captain Charles Daniel after he raided Baleen. The fort was occupied from 1639 to 1641. Fort St. Anne is a National Historic Site. So this is also where Fort Baleen was, the Scottish fort. Associated forts. Two other military forts were eventually built adjacent to the fort. Simon Dennis's fort and Fort Dauphin, built in 1713 which was addition from 1713 to 1758. Fort Dauphin. After Queen Anne's War, French officer Jean-Baptiste Hurdle de Rouville, this fellow, and others established Fort Dauphin in 1713 as the capital of Ile Royale, prior to the establishment of Louisbourg. De Rouville played a role in the early settlement of both present-day Englishtown, 1719 to 1722, and St. Peter's in 1713 to 1718. Here's another person who died at the fort. This is Philippe de Pasteur de Costebelle, who died in Fort Dauphin in 1717. De Rouville, going back to here again, is him. As commander of the fleet, Edward Tyng led 13 armed vessels and about 90 transports in the successful siege of Louisbourg in 1745. He participated in the capture of the Vigilant and the destruction of Port Dauphin, Englishtown, in June 1745. Again, this isn't Louisbourg, it's a different place. Burning 40 houses and an equal number of vessels. Now we skip forward. To York Redoubt. York Redoubt was a key element in the defense of Halifax Harbor in the 19th and 20th centuries, and saw many additions to the fortifications. It's here. And so it was a command center for the local harbor defenses in World War II, which included observation posts, a defensive minefield, and a new gun battery below the fort at Sleepy Cove, covering the anti-submarine net which stretched across the harbor's entrance from Fort McNabb on McNabb's Island. York Redoubt remained in military use until 1956. Here is the minefield during the Second World War. It says, an anti-submarine net running between York Redoubt and McNabb's Island in 1942. Buildings in the Redoubt complex include what remains of the Duke of York's Martello Tower, built in 1798. So it's not complete, such as the Prince of Wales Martello Tower. Other fortifications from around 1800 and 1900, and advanced fortifications and artillery from World War II. York Redoubt had many examples of rifled muzzle-loader cannon from the 1870s period. An open-air collection of unmounted cannon within the fort has several pieces of artillery of various periods, including a large 9.62-inch breech loader that had been mounted at the Sandwich Point Battery as part of the York Redoubt complex. Structures at the water's edge at Sleepy Cove Battery, now closed to the public, include 3 searchlight batteries, 2 concrete lookout towers, and 2 gun emplacements, which originally held 2 12-pounder guns, but were later replaced with 6-pounder guns. On 28 June 1985, Canada Post issued York Redoubt, Nova Scotia, one of the 20 stamps in the Forts Across Canada series, 1983 and 1985. The last location, Sandwich Point Battery. The series of 4 gun emplacements was constructed during World War I, 1 kilometer away from the main fort at York Redoubt, to protect the approaches to Halifax Harbor. During World War II, the 2 dated 9.2-inch breech-loading guns were removed, but the 2 6-inch breech loaders were retained throughout the war. The battery is currently derelict and completely contained within the Department of National Defense, fenced land, which is home to Canadian Forces Naval Engineering School, and is strictly off limits to the public. The gates restrict road access to Gas Lane via fire and smoke roads from John Brackett. So this one isn't a museum. It's still Canadian Forces Engineer School, Naval Engineering School. This ends our presentation of the Fortifications of Nova Scotia, Part 2, including Halifax region and Cape Breton.